Hello, everyone. Sorry, there's been a little bit of a lag in the videos. This has to do a little bit with where I was with my course and also just some other life stuff coming up. Anyway, today we are going to look at an introduction to binding theory. We ultimately will revise some of the approaches that we present today with binding. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. So we're going to build our understanding of binding theory based off of the phrase structure grammar that we've already been establishing and the structural relations that we have developed. Now, I also want to give a shout out to my student Ramsey, who has lent me this very cool draw pad. I'm getting a hang of it. It is super helpful, but I still have a few learning issues with it. So there might be a few times where the draw pad, through user error, leads to some little foibles. Anyway, so what are the basic things that we're dealing with when we're talking about binding theory? And let me actually, while we just talk about this, let me make myself bigger. There we go. So what are the basic things that we're talking about when we're talking about binding theory? Well, we're talking about three basic principles. We're going to be talking about, or three basic types of linguistic items. We're going to be looking at the distributions of a set of items referred to as anaphora or anaphors. And these are typically items that in English end in self. And we can also look in the same category are other types of reflexive expressions. So also expressions like each other. So in the sentence, John saw himself, we can make a few observations about this sentence and the meaning of himself in that sentence. So John saw himself. There is a mandatory co-interpretation, what we're going to refer to as co-reference between himself and John. They must refer to the same individual, the same entity. This is the same with these reflexive expressions, so expressions like each other. Today is Valentine's Day, so we could use an expression like Mary and Susan love each other. So there we see that each other has, again, that mandatory co-reference, that mandatory reference, that matching of identity with Mary and Susan. So that's the individuals that are being referred to by that expression, each other. So that's the general phenomenon of anaphora, and that's one of the sets of expressions that we're going to want to analyze today. The other set of expressions are pronominals, pronouns, and these have somewhat similar types of interpretations in some contexts, but also very dissimilar interpretations in other contexts. So we can take, again, a very similar set of sentences. So let's say John saw him. Well, in that expression, we'll make a few observations. Well, one, in the sentence John saw him, John and him must obligatorily not refer to the same individual. They, in fact, cannot co-refer. So we cannot get this state that we had with John saw himself, where we get this mutual identity between John and him. Now, if we make this a slightly different expression, a slightly different sentence, John's mother saw him, suddenly that identity between John and him is at least allowable, but it's no longer mandatory like it was with himself. So you can get a match between John and him, but you don't have to. So it's allowable in that context. We can also see this in other sentences. So John thought Mary said he should leave. There again, this can refer back to John, that he can refer back to John, or it can refer to another individual sort of out there in the discourse. So pronouns have this sort of in-between status where they may refer back to expressions earlier, or they may not. So that's one of the other things we're going to want to explore in our discussion today. And then the final set of expressions we're going to want to look at are what we're going to call referring expressions, or are expressions. And these are really just all other nouns. And we're going to do a little bit less, we're going to care a lot less in a lot of ways about their behavior. But these types of expressions are things like John, Mary, an apple, Selicum, Melissa, my car. All of these are expressions. They're referring expressions. They refer to entities in the world. And I will define a principle with respect to our binding domains for them, but we're not going to worry as much about these. So let's turn our attention, adjust myself a little bit here. Let's turn our attention to those anaphora. So again, let's look at our sentences here. I'm going to do a comparative sentence between well, we're getting some of our user error where I am not. It was working so well when I practiced with it, and now I can't get it to draw. So I will have to go back. Well, that's fine. Get it next time. So our sentences are going to be John saw himself, and John saw him. So these are our two sentences, and we want to say, okay, what do we know about these sentences? Well, again, we know that in the first sentence, John saw himself, there is obligatory reference between John and himself. And in sentence 2, there is a obligatory non-reference. So John refers to one individual, and him refers to a different individual. And this is obligatory. Now, we can represent this in our sentences and in our trees with a little symbol. Can't really do it in Paint very easily, but the way we're going to do this is we're going to use these little subscripts. So if you can tell, those are subscript J's next to John. These are what we're going to refer to as our co-indexations. These are our ways of tagging that these refer to the same individual. By convention, they start at J. Why they start at J, I don't know. It's just the convention. Actually, sometimes they start at, doesn't matter. They start at They start randomly. Sometimes they start at I. I started at J. So in our other sentence, we'll co-index John with J, and we'll co-index him with K. And there we go. And that shows that these refer to disparate individuals. And this is actually going to form a really kind of key element in our understanding, at least our definition of what it means to be, what is happening in these relationships. Because fundamentally what we're going to be developing is a theory of how these relationships are sort of formally encoded in the syntax. And we're going to refer to this relationship as binding. So these, John and himself, have a binding relationship together. They are bound together. Or himself is, more precisely, himself is bound by John, while him is not bound. And that seems to be important. And we can compare this again. Let's compare this to another sentence. So another sentence I gave was John's mother saw him. Perfectly grammatical. And this one allows either this interpretation of him being a John, or him being another entity out there in the world, say Celicum. So this him is a little bit of a little bit of a mystery to us for right now. We also should make another note here that I cannot say John's mother saw himself, where himself refers back to John. Now, potentially it could there could be a co-indexation relationship between John's mother and himself, if John's mother now identifies with he, him pronouns. But with this relationship where we want John to co-refer with himself, this is ungrammatical. And it's these types of observations that are going to be really critical for us. Okay.
I don't have an answer for that.
Alexa can't help us out here, so we're going to have to figure this out on our own. All right, so
To answer your question, the lowest point in Illinois is 279 feet at the Mississippi River.
Alexa's just full of facts today. All right, let us go to a let's draw a tree. When in doubt, draw a tree. That should always be your lesson. It's a good life lesson. It is a good syntax lesson, linguistics lesson. Trees are awesome, both in terms of like actual living trees and syntactic trees. So when in doubt, we draw a tree. So let's draw a tree of John saw himself. So we're going to get our noun phrase here, John. We'll have our verb phrase here. Saw. And another noun phrase here. Himself. Okay. Couple quick notes I want to make. So I mentioned this idea of co-indexation. Key thing with co-indexation is that co-indexation is a property of phrases. Right now we're dealing with single word phrases, but it really is fundamentally a property of phrases. So if you imagine I have a much more complicated noun phrase like the man in a purple coat with a large, silly yellow hat from Boston saw himself. Well, that whole noun phrase is the thing that is being co-indexed with himself. So it is the whole noun phrase that bears the co-indexation. So here I'm going to use, again, that J co-indexation and mark that this thing is co-indexed. Okay, so let's make a few observations here. We can look at this tree, John saw himself, and we can say, okay, cool. What are some observations we can make? Well, the first observation we might want to make is that John, this noun phrase John, is in an asymmetric C-command relation with himself. This might be important. Hint, this is going to be real important to us. So John asymmetrically C-commands himself. The asymmetric part is going to be more important for us later on, but for now, we just need to note that John C-commands himself, and John is co-indexed. So they're marked as being these co-referential items. We could test this again, see what happens if we just try to reverse the sentence. So himself saw John. Oh, that is pretty terrible. So, cool. Maybe we can make some observations here. So we can say, John, or these types of expressions, anaphors, why am I trying to write that by hand? Anaphors need to be C-commanded and co-indexed by their antecedent. All right, some fancy terms in there. I added this new term antecedent. All the antecedent is the element that gives the anaphor its meaning. So John here is our antecedent for himself. It precedes himself, and it gives himself that sort of core meaning. So if we say something like anaphors need to be C-commanded and co-indexed by their antecedent, maybe that works. Well, we can test this. Let's try it. So let's look at our sentence here. So another option we could maybe entertain is that anaphors must precede must be preceded by their antecedents and co-indexed. Perhaps that would be sufficient. But we would run into this problem of sentences like John's mother saw himself. So again, when in doubt, draw a tree. Should get a t-shirt that says that. When in doubt, draw a tree. If anyone starts marketing that, I want to cut. I know that's going to be the next hot seller. When in doubt, draw a tree. So this is going to be I want to note right now that this sort of structural relation that we're doing inside the noun phrase is going to be something we're going to modify pretty extensively in a couple weeks. So just keep that in mind. This is building towards future things. It also doesn't currently follow our phrase structure rules, but we don't really have a way to deal with possessives in our phrase structure rules. So this is the best way in our current phrase structure rules to deal with it. And it'll certainly show the deficiencies in that other analysis where we looked just at precedents. Should be a VP. Okay, so here we are trying to get himself and we're trying to have co-reference between this NP here, John's, and himself. And what we get is ungrammaticality. Well, why did we get ungrammaticality? So if we look at this definition that I just provided, anaphors need to be C-commanded and co-indexed by their antecedent. Well, it's going to fail on one of these accounts. This noun phrase is not in a C-command relation with this noun phrase. They're co-indexed, but not C-commanded. We can actually call this rule that I just gave principle A. You might also see it referred to as condition A. It's stated slightly differently in some cases. Typically says anaphors must be C-commanded and co-indexed, or anaphors must be bound by their antecedent. Bound. And this language is simply to be bound is to be both C-commanded and to be co-indexed. So principle A says an anaphor must be bound. We're going to do a slight revision of this in our next video. We're going to provide a little bit more nuance to this, and then of course later in the term we'll tackle this again. So I want to look now at our other example that we have up here, which is our pronouns. So what's going on with our pronouns? And we can actually deal with these pretty easily with the trees we've already got. I'm just going to boop, boop, boop. Bye-bye, self. So if I try to have co-indexation here, I get ungrammaticality. So this is ungrammatical if this is co-indexed. And I'll just mark that with a little asterisk there. But it's perfectly grammatical if him refers to another individual. That's interesting. More telling here is this example. So obviously him is grammatical in this context, but it's also grammatical under either interpretation. It's grammatical under the co-indexation interpretation or under a wider interpretation. So what can we say about this? Well, C-command still seems to be playing a role, but co-indexation is still playing a role. What is the role, though? It seems to be the inverse. And more or less, that's what we're going to say. Is if we look at this, if we look at the distribution of these two sentences, John saw him. There, the co-indexation is disallowed. Here, co-indexation is allowed. Well, why is co-indexation allowed in John's mother saw him? Because him isn't bound. It's not C-commanded. We can define this as principle B. Now, there's a little bit more nuance to this, and I want to just alert us to this nuance, but we're going to really tackle it in the next video. which is that there are contexts where pronouns can be C commanded and C commanded and co-indexed and the sentence be grammatical, and where anaphors can be C commanded and co-indexed and the sentence be ungrammatical. So examples of these are sentences like John thought that Mary said he should leave. So that he is going to be in a co-indexation relationship. Co-indexation, so it's going to be bound by John. But it has the same properties as him. Obviously, himself is not allowed, and there's no sort of nominative version of himself. If we construct a similar sentence, so with a more traditional accusative, you still can't get that sentence. So John wanted Mary to give him a ride. John wanted Mary to give himself a ride. Doesn't work unless Mary and himself are co-indexed. Himself cannot be co-indexed with John in that context. So there's another limiting factor that we need to discuss with respect to these binding principles. But these two binding principles should get us started. So that's what we're going to start with. We'll work with these today. And then on the next video, we'll tackle those more challenging sentences and start to put a few more limitations on binding and when binding is on both of these principles. All right. So again, welcome back to the video series. Sorry about the little bit of a delay here on getting these produced. Thank you all. And like always, I would like to end with a quote. I'm going with a quote from Fred Rogers, good old Mr. Rogers here. Real strength has to do with helping others. And like always, I hope everyone is being healthy and safe. And I will see you next time.